One of black's pawns is going to become a queen. But which one? Well, the answer might surprise you. So if you want to go ahead and comment below, which pawn do you think of black's is going to become a queen? Just take a random guess if you want. And then as the game unfolds, you can take further guesses or kind of try to figure it out as you see the game. And I think you're going to be surprised. I think most people are not going to be able to predict which pawn is going to become a queen. But let me know in the comments if you did successfully predict that, okay? So this is a really fun game played by Capablanca. Goes into the end game. And, well, like I said, one of these guys is going to become a queen. All right, let's go ahead and jump right in. This is episode 32 in the series where we're going through Logical Chess. We're almost done with the book, guys. There's only one more game after this. And so at the end of the video, I'm going to be asking you guys your opinion on what to do next. I have some interesting things to share with you, so make sure you stick around for that. But let's go ahead and jump in to this game. So Capablanca is playing as black. He plays knight f6. He plays e6, b6. And he fianchettos his bishop here to kind of counter what white is doing. So both bishops end up on the same diagonal. He throws in the check, bishop to d2, and he trades the bishop. Now, we have an interesting moment in the game here. Queen takes or knight takes. The player decided to take with the knight. And I think most people think that that's kind of pretty logical, right? Like you're trying to develop your pieces as quickly as you can. Why not take with a piece? Now you have all three of your pieces developed, right? I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Technically, a lot of people would argue that that's not the best move, and it's actually better to take with the queen. Now, why would that be the case? What do you guys think? Well, the answer is if you take with the queen, now your knight is still able to go to c3. And c3, let's just say, for example, castles in knight c3, c3 is a better square for the knight. You're controlling more squares. You control 8 squares as opposed to only 6 when you're sitting on d2. And you're getting more pressure on this d5 square, which is a kind of an important square in a lot of cases. And so because you get the knight there, it's actually considered better. The other thing to think about is even if you do take with the knight, you're going to move your queen at some point anyway, probably to connect your rooks. And so if you're going to just move it anyway, you may as well just take it now and then put your knight on c3. That's kind of the idea. And so a lot of strong players nowadays will take with the queen here instead of the knight in these types of situations when you have the option. Okay, so just something to think about. But in the game, this player decided to just recapture with the knight. All right, so Capablanca castles, white castles. He plays c5, which is a good way to strike at the center when you're playing as black. And white takes it, and he recaptures. Now, what do you notice about the position after this trade has happened? There are a couple of key points that should jump out at you. All right, well, if you had a chance to think about that, the first thing is that he's exchanged a non-central pawn for a central pawn. That's usually a pretty good thing, right? Because the pawns in the center can be very valuable. They control key squares. So if you are able to trade a side pawn for a center pawn, a lot of times that's a good decision, which is what happens here. The other thing is this pawn actually controls this d4 square, which is kind of important. And we're going to see that as the game goes on. This is a critical square, which we'll get to. And then the last thing is he opens up the b file for his pieces. Okay, and we're going to see how that might play a role in the game as well. So those are kind of some of the things that should jump out at you. All right, let's keep going. So white plays queen c2. That's what I was talking about. You know, after you develop the pieces in castle, you're going to have to move your queen anyway. And so earlier we talked about the idea of taking with the queen. All right, knight c6 develops the knight. Rook to d1. Queen to b6. He's already using the fact that he can take advantage of that file with his queen. a3. White's not really trying to play b4, probably was just afraid of the knight coming in here and wants to prevent that, so he plays a3. Rook a to b8. Okay, there's a principle in chess. Rooks should go on open or half open files. Okay, this is what's called a half open file because there's only one color pawn on it. Okay, this is also the d file is an example of a half open file for white. Okay, but black is following the principle, getting the rook on the open file, and already, you know, if this bishop ever moves, you're going to have a threat to just capture the pawn on b2, right? White plays rook a to b1. Now, this is interesting because it kind of looks like they both have played basically the same move, right? But Capablanca's move is much better and much stronger because his rook is going to the half open file where it's active. It's going to be putting pressure on the opponent's position and controlling all of these squares in the meantime, right, along the b file. Whereas white's rook is simply defending a pawn. That's literally the only thing it's doing. It's not a half open file for him. His rook is not controlling all of these other squares like black's rook is. So you can see how even though the same move, it's very different. It's a very different situation. Okay, this rook is doing a better job for white. All right, so Capablanca brings the other rook to the C file, and a lot of times when you're developing your rooks, you want to try to anticipate what's most likely going to happen as the game goes on. And he's anticipating that this section of the board is where his rooks are going to be most effective, right? He could have played rook e8 if he thought something was going to happen here. He could have played rook d8, but he's planning for the action to happen right here, okay? And you don't always know, and sometimes you do have to change that as the game goes on, but it's good to try to, your best guesstimate of like, where do you think the action is going to happen, all right? e4, e5. And when Capablanca sees the move e4, this d4 square probably jumped out at him. Why is that such a big deal? Because as soon as e4 is played, you no longer have a pawn that can control the d4 square, which means it's a very nice target for his pieces to jump into. And he wanted to make sure that he solidified that and he's ready to jump in. Now, you might say, but isn't he doing the same thing on the d5 square? And he is. And actually, white tries to take advantage of that in the next couple of moves, but Capablanca beats him to it by jumping his knight in first, okay? We'll talk more about that in just a second, but first I have to back up for a second here, because after this move queen d3 is interesting. He's attacking along here, and maybe he's trying to invade with the queen. So what does Capablanca do? He plays d6. Now, what do you guys notice about the position? There should be something that jumps out at you right away. All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that, hopefully you said, well, the queen could just take the pawn. It's a free pawn, right? Except it's not a free pawn because guess what? Rook to d8 actually traps white's queen. If you look carefully, all of the squares along the file have been taken away. This is defended by the knight. This is defended by the queen, This is defended. This is defended by the knight and by the pawn. The queen is totally trapped. This is defended. It can't do anything, and it's simply a blunder, okay? So very clever little move there by Capablanca. If you don't play d6, you play something else, you have to worry about maybe the queen is going to come in there and then start causing you problems. And so very, very clever move by Capablanca. Okay, so let's keep going. So like I said, was saying, white is now trying to relocate their knight on d5, just like Capablanca is going to do on d4. But what you will notice is he wins the race. He gets his knight there first, starts threatening things. He's also unleashing his bishop, which is now attacking this. So that's a problem for white. And so white decides to trade to add us a defender here. But in doing so, when Capablanca recaptures, guess what? Now your knight's going to have a hard time getting to where it was trying to go. Okay, so the speed at which Capablanca did that actually played a significant role in this position. Now, it kind of looks like this might be the pawn that's going to become a queen. But what do you guys think? Do you think this is the one that's going to become a queen, or do you think it's a different pawn? Keep thinking about that as we go through the game, all right? All right, let's keep going. So we have b4, and the general principle is when somebody has a pawn chain, you want to attack the base of the pawn chain, right? So rather than trying to attack here for some reason, he's trying to attack over here and see if he can undermine the pawn structure here. So this is a good moment to pause, and this is not an easy one, but how do you deal with the threat that white has? There's actually a threat associated with this move, and if you want to pause and try to think through this a little bit, what do you think you should play? All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that, you have to be a little bit careful here because, for example, if you were to just take this pawn, the rook is going to take. You have to move your queen somewhere. And then there's quite a few things, but even just taking here, and notice how white has totally undermined your strong pawns in the center. They now have a target, and this is just not a good situation for you. Okay, so you don't really want to take and relieve that there. But if you just leave it and you don't do anything, white is going to take you, unleash their rook, and there are actually some tactics where they could sacrifice and then push this pawn, which unleashes the bishop. They get your knight. It gets kind of complicated, but you have to be really, really careful. And so the way that Capablanca deals with all of those potential problems is with the move queen to c6. And queen to c6 is very interesting because it does a couple of things. Number one, you get away from the rook. So you're not in line with the rook anymore. You don't have to worry about that. Number two, remember I said that this pawn could push forward in some situations and like create multiple attacks? Well, guess what happens if you push forward now? I mean, it's just, thank you very much. That's checkmate, right? So he stops that, gets away from the rook, and he now has three pieces attacking the pawn on e4. So it's a really powerful move. It does so many different things all at the same time. Queen c6 was a great a great move. Congratulations if you were able to see that. All right, so white decides to capture. He takes back. Rook takes b7. Now, this is actually an interesting sacrifice, and it has to do with what I just kind of showed you with the bishop and the pawn. And there's something that you need to understand about this. If you can ever get a knight and a bishop for a rook and a pawn, that's usually good for the player who gets the knight and the bishop. So that is what white is trying to do. He sacrifices his rook, then he plays e5 with the double attack here and here. And his idea is that after the queen moves, he's going to take here. He's going to get those two pieces for the rook and the pawn, and he thinks he's going to be winning. And Stockfish actually kind of agrees with that, like this should be good for white, but Capablanca was thinking way ahead this game, and it's actually really interesting. So he goes here, white trades, and Capablanca trades. And the general rule is don't trade pieces when you're down material, but there's something that you need to understand about the rooks. Rooks are endgame pieces. They get better and stronger as the game goes on and less pieces are on the board. So even though you could say this trade is actually good for white, as the game gets closer to the end game, the rooks are going to be powerful, especially when they have files they can invade into the enemy position. Okay, so this was a kind of a critical moment in the game, right? Because white decided to go for this trade thinking that like, okay, I'm going to win easily now. I got the knight and the bishop. But Capablanca was like, no. I've got this passed pawn. I also have my rooks. It's not going to be that easy. And well, let's keep going with the game. So he plays rook to d8. Very powerful move, pinning the knight so that it's not able to come into the game. Bishop to d5. He's trying to move his king to get away from the pin. And the only way to do that is to give the king somewhere to run to. The rook comes to the b file. And let me just make sure I didn't want to say anything else here. All right, let's keep going. King g2 gets out of the pin. The other rook invades, and again, he's offering a trade, and white says, all right, let's go ahead. I have the two pieces. I'm pretty happy. But don't forget about the passed pawn. And it's starting to look like this is going to be the pawn that might become a queen, right? That's what it looks like. Let's keep going and see what happens next. The knight comes into the game. He takes a3. The knight goes to e4, getting ready to undermine here. And now, guess what? We have a new passed pawn. So it could be this pawn too, right? So what do you guys think? Let me know. a5, the knight captures, and he takes. Now, question for you guys. Why did Capablanca choose this moment to take this pawn? What do you guys think? Well, if you had a chance to think about that, the answer is he wants to make sure that his king can come into the game, okay, at some point. And if he tries to do that immediately right now, white will now play the move knight to d7 check. And you can't go here because the pawn. You can't go here because the pawn simply captures and becomes a queen and you can't stop it. So you have to go back to where you came from and you just totally wasted your time. Your king is still stuck over here. And I don't know how your king's going to get into the game to help. So because of that, Capablanca said, okay, I need to take this pawn so that I can now move my king whenever I need to. I have multiple ways to get into the game. That's what needed to happen. Okay, so he takes the pawn. White plays king f1. And what do you guys think you should play here as black? And actually, let me ask you this. Should you play a4 or is a4 a mistake? That is the question. All right, if you had a chance to look at that, a4 is a good move. That's what Capablanca played. And if you thought it was a bad move because bishop c6 is a double attack and it looks like you're losing your pawn, you're mistaken because the rook comes down with check. The king has to move, and guess what? Now your pawn goes to safety, and it's about to become a queen. Black's going to win very easily, okay? So I wanted to see if you noticed that, all right? So a4 is a good move, and that's what Capablanca plays. White plays king e2, trying to bring the king closer. Rook to a1, clearing the way for this guy, and do you still have a guess on which pawn is going to become a queen? Well, you're probably wrong. I'm just going to say that. You're probably wrong. All right, let's keep going. The knight goes to d3, and this is the moment in the game where Stockfish says white lost it, okay, which is fascinating because all up to now it was like white was fine, white was fine, white was fine. And Stockfish says if you play knight to d7, attacking this pawn, you're actually in good shape because now if this happens, you push your c pawn, you're going to sacrifice your bishop here so that that doesn't become a queen. But you've got the c pawn. Your king's coming up to take this. And you also, because your knight is on d7, you're stopping the king from coming over, which is kind of a critical detail. And apparently this is supposed to be a draw. I'm not going to get into the rest of the line. It's kind of complicated, but white does have this that black has to worry about. The rook's going to have to pay attention to that since the king can't come over. This is probably going to get captured, and it should be a draw with perfect play. What's interesting is in the game, white didn't see this idea of knight to d7. I think they missed this critical point of cutting off the king, and instead they played knight to d3, probably thinking that they want to keep their knight closer to this pawn to help with the bishop and stop it, right? Which makes a lot of sense, but it wasn't the correct idea. Okay, now black is just in a winning position. a3 pushes the pawn. Let's see. White plays c5, and black plays the move a2. Now, this is actually threatening to win immediately. If you would like to pause, what is black's threat to win the game from this position? We had a chance to look at that. If white, wastes some time or does some random move like pushes the pawn, let's just say black is going to throw in the check. Even though they lose the rook, it doesn't really matter because you're going to get a queen, and this is not far enough. The queen is going to be powerful enough to stop this. Something like queen c1, take the pawn, and black is going to win very, very easily. Okay, so that's the threat. Okay, rook to e1 check. So that's what white needs to stop, and because of that, they play the move king to f3. By playing king f3, there is no check with the rook, which means if you move your rook now, you simply lose your pawn. Okay, so that is white's idea. And so Capablanca, instead of going to attack the king, attacks the knight. Okay? Now, of course, if you're white, you can't allow this to happen. And so they take the a-pawn. So if you said the a-pawn, I'm sorry, you are mistaken. That's not the correct one. Which one do you think it is? Probably this one, right? Let's see. So rook takes d3, and so he essentially now wins the knight for the pawn, and we end up with this bishop against rook ending, but it's still not that simple because there is this passed pawn that black has to be careful of, and also white's king is in a pretty good spot. So let's keep going. King goes to e4, rook goes to d2, bishop to c4, and there's a couple of things that black has to be careful of. So let me just ask you guys this. If you're playing this position as black, what would you do? If you had a chance to look at that, I hope you didn't say rook takes f2. Because even though it looks like an obvious move, you just blundered. And here's why. Because c6, this pawn is getting ready to become a queen. You could try to go here and stop it, but the king is just going to take. Your rook is cut off, and this is actually a losing position. You can go check. It doesn't really matter. Bishop d3. Your rook is in big trouble, and guess what? You can't stop this guy. Rook a2, for example. c7. You can come down here, but look what happens. The bishop just moves somewhere. It controls the square, and you're in trouble. Okay, you're going to lose the game. So you had to be careful. Okay, I think a lot of people could very easily go wrong here. When there's a passed pawn like this, you have to make sure you're paying close attention to it. So what does Capablanca do? King to f8. Okay, he uses the king to make sure that that pawn is not going to become a queen. Because now if you try to push it, the king's just going to come over, and guess what? Thank you very much. I'm just going to take the pawn. Okay, so critical moment, king f8. You have to play that move. All right, let's keep going. So white plays f3 instead. And now black takes the h2 pawn. Any guesses on which pawn is going to become the queen? Still not easy to tell, is it? All right, let's keep going. King takes d4. Well, it wasn't the d pawn. There goes that one. Answers that question. Which one do you think it is? All right, let's keep going. King e7. He's got to keep the king close to stopping this pawn. Bishop goes back. h5. And I'm going to kind of go quickly through some of these next moves, I think, because it gets a little bit complicated. Basically, white is just trying to set up this fortress where the bishop just kind of sits there and the pawn is here and you can't really get through because you can't get past because of these pawns and the king. That's kind of what white is trying to do. Black has to figure out a way around that. And it is not easy to figure all this out, but let's just keep going. Rook g2 attacks the pawn. King defends the pawn. He goes rook to g1. The reason he goes rook to g1 is because he wants to get his rook behind the passed pawn. Okay, this is a key point. Rooks should go behind passed pawns in the endgame. Well, you can't do it right now because the bishop is stopping you. So he goes rook g1 so that he can come over here, get behind the passed pawn. Because once you're behind the passed pawn, you're not only attacking it, you're also controlling every single square that it would like to move to for the rest of its journey to becoming a queen. It was a very good spot. Same thing as if white had a rook. So you can get your rook behind it. That would have been a great spot. Okay, so bishop goes here, gets to behind c6. Now, we have this interesting situation where black has the rook, which obviously is better than the bishop, but this pawn's kind of annoying. And you don't have a clear way to make progress because white has the pawns and the king kind of stopping you. Okay, and so this is kind of the moment of the game where it gets a little bit complicated. So I'll just kind of go through some of these moves a little bit quickly. Rook c3, c7. Actually, yeah, I do need to talk about this. Okay, so right here, Rook c3 is a very, very powerful move. And he's using the concept of Zugzwang. And this is a very common concept in endgames. Zugzwang is basically where you put your opponent in a position where they have to make a move, but they don't want to. If they could just pass, their position is rock solid. It's fine. There's nothing that you could really do, right? I mean, and you can see white's position. It's very, very good. You can't take the pawn, it's offended. You can't get to the king, it's guarded by these pieces. You can't push your pawns because they're just going to get captured, right? Seems like white's position is rock solid. But when he plays rook to c3, he forces white to make a move. And if you look carefully, there's not a lot of good options. He's cutting off the king's escape square from back here. The king is cut off here and here and here. So you only have a couple of options. You can either push the pawn, which is what was played in the game. He decided to go this route. We'll talk about why in just a second. Or you can move your king, or you can try to find a place to move your bishop to, right? So let's go ahead and go one at a time through some of these moves. All right, first of all, if you try to play king f5, just moving your king, watch what's going to happen. Rook check forces the king back. Then the king comes up. The king tries to run away because what else are you going to do? And now you can push your f pawn. And then you take this guy. Okay, and notice how the bishop at this point is no longer capable of defending the pawn. Okay, so this idea of going here, pushing the pawn after the king is forced back. All right, going back to this critical position, instead of king f5, what if white would have tried to just move the bishop? Say, I'll just move my bishop, here, still defend it. Watch what happens. Rook to c5, okay, attacks the bishop. You've got to defend your pawn, so you only have a couple of options. I guess you could. Two options, sorry. You can move your bishop back, but then again the king comes up, and again we're going to get the same situation of like once this pawn pushes, your bishop has to leave and you lose the pawn. The other thing is king to e4, and I think there's an interesting line here that we're going to look at. f5 check. You can't take it because you're bishop. So the king moves here, attacks the rook, defends the bishop. What do you do as black? There's a critical move in this position. See if you guys can find it. This is not easy, but it's a nice move. All right, if you had a chance to look at that, it's rook takes d5. And this is a really common idea in endgames, especially when you have the more powerful piece. A lot of times the way that you win is by sacrificing it at the right moment. And this is the right moment. You take that away, you use your pawns to sneak by, and you use your king to stop this guy. Okay, so for example, you play f4. If they take you, guess what? Your h-pawn is going to go. And they can try to sneak around, but you're going to block them off before they're able to get a queen, and they can't stop you. Okay? The other way that this could have happened would have been when you play f4, they immediately try to sneak around. They don't even take you, but watch this. Takes. You're going to get the queen first with check, check. You can come down here and do this little fancy thing and checkmate them with your queen. All right? So that's kind of nice. So just to make sure we're understanding what's going on here. All of that was if, after rook c3, white either decided to move their king or decided to move their bishop. They were going to get forced into a losing position based on some of the lines that I showed you. And it's very complicated, so don't feel bad if you don't see all those, but it is going to be a losing position. So what white decided to do instead, since it's Zugzwang, they have to play some move. They don't want to play g4 because it allows this guy to sneak past, right? They decide, okay, I'll just give up this pawn, and I'll just hope that this position is solid enough that I can still, hang on for a draw, okay? So that's how we ended up here, where Capablanca finally gets rid of the c-pawn. All right, we're not done yet. Let's keep going. And I still am wondering, have you figured out which pawn is going to become a queen yet? It's pretty funny. All right, bishop d5, he attacks the bishop. There's going to be some dancing around, and basically what he's trying to do is take away the squares from the bishop in such a way that white doesn't really have any moves, and he kind of accomplishes that. If you look carefully, you can't go here. You can't go here. or you get captured. You can't go here. You can't go here or here. The only place you could go is here, but then guess what? You get pinned, so you actually can't go there either. And so he's totally taken away all the squares from the bishop. You don't want to push this pawn because you allow this guy to sneak past. The king doesn't have really anywhere to go except here and here. Okay, that's the only moves that white has left. So they play king e3. Rook a5, we get some more dancing around. Again, I don't want to get into all the details because it does get a little bit complicated, but he's slowly but surely inching his king forward, taking away some of the key moves that white has. And let's keep going. I want to just kind of show you guys the end here. He plays f5. He plays king f6. He checks. He brings his king into a better position. And he's finally ready to break through. Now, again, if you would like to take a final guess, which of these 3 pawns is going to become the queen? Let me know in the comments if you guessed it correctly. When I was looking at this game, I did not. So, all right, let's keep going. F4. He has to bust through. And this, let's see, king g2, I think was played. If you take the pawn, the problem is, what was the problem here? I'm trying to remember. The king just takes, yeah, and you're just in trouble. I mean, the rook's coming in, the pawn is going to go. It's just not good. So in the game, he played king g2, and then f5 was played. And here, white resigned because they realized what was going to happen. But let me go ahead and show you guys the line that would have played out if they decided to play on. King to h3, you trade, they trade, you go h4 check, they go here, you go here, here. Here, you sacrifice the h-pawn so that you can sacrifice your rook. Remember what I said, sacrificing at the end to win at the right moment. They take you, and guess what? It was the f7 pawn that sat on f7 for like 50-something moves that is now going to become the queen. Did anybody guess the f7 pawn? I'm going to say probably not, but if you did, let me know in the comments. And now it's just a question of escorting this guy all the way home. Fascinating game. I mean, that alone is just kind of, I think, fun, right? So I hope you guys enjoyed that. I had a lot of fun with this game. And it also very instructive on how to win an endgame like that. And it illustrates how when you have a small advantage at the endgame, you have to be very, very careful with how you execute it. All right, guys, now don't go anywhere. I need your help. I need you to put something else in the comments as well for me, okay? We have one more game in this book, okay? Game number 33, then we're done. So that'll happen next week. I need your help to determine what we're going to do next. And I have a stack of books here that I am going to go through right now very quickly and explain what these are. Okay, I think we should choose one of these. I've did a lot of research. These are all very highly recommended books. And so I'm going to go through one at a time. I want you guys to let me know which one you want to do next or some combination of them. Maybe if we could like alternate between 1 or 2 or 3 or something. I don't know. You guys let me know. I'm just going to start at the top here. 100 endgames you must know. One of the things I like about this book is it's 100 endgames, but they're very practical. He talks about how he doesn't want to just include these random ones that you're never going to see. Very practical positions that will show up that you will need to know to improve as a player. Okay, some of them are easier, some of them are more difficult. Very, very thorough book. I've looked at some of it already. Very, very nice. I like that. Okay, so if you want to learn some endgames, 100 endgames you must know. Next on the list we have Bobby Fischer's My 60 Memorable Games. Okay, these are just like it says, it's 60 games that Bobby Fischer played, and he annotates what he was thinking. So as you're going through the game, he'll put things like, oh, I was considering moving here, but then my opponent did this, and I didn't expect that, or I did, and I thought they were going to do this, and whatever. It's kind of you see inside the mind of Bobby Fischer. Okay, he was a world champion. If you don't know who Bobby Fischer was, I think most people do, but one of the greatest players to ever play the game. Of course, would he beat Magnus Carlsen? Who would win? Who knows, right? But he was very, very good, and I've heard a lot of good things about this book. Okay, My 60 Memorable Games. Next, we have Secrets of Modern Chess Strategy, and I want you to pay attention to this section right here, or this subtitle, I should say, Advances Since Nimzowitsch. Okay, so let me explain what this book is. There is a book called My System by Nimzowitsch, which is an older book. I think it was 1920s, if I'm not mistaken, where he kind of introduced a lot of positional concepts in that book, in the My System book. Okay, it was like, tempo at the start of the game is important. Controlling the center, open files, bad bishops, the bishop pair, knights on outposts, all these positional type of things that you should think about. It was one of the leading books that a lot of players used and learned from, and that's great. But as time has gone on, we've learned since that, like, okay, yes, it's nice to have those principles, but there are exceptions sometimes. And sometimes, it's better to get the doubled or tripled pawns because of some other reason in the position, right? Even though you're going against that principle of don't get doubled pawns, right? That's what this book talks about. He basically looks at the things that Nimzowitsch said through a modern viewpoint, right? This was the 1990s. So 70 something years later, he looks at like, okay, let's talk about those things and let's see, wait a second, is that always the best case or are there exceptions? What do those exceptions look like? And that's kind of what it is. So positional strategy, how did it change? If that sounds interesting to you, Secrets of Modern Chess Strategy, okay? Next up, we have another kind of middle game strategy book called How to Reassess Your Chess, okay, by Jeremy Silman. This book is a monster. It's over 600 pages long. Now, a lot of those are answers to questions. There's like tests to test yourself, and then there's like couple hundred pages of answers, I think. But still, it's a very long book. If I had to summarize this in one sentence, it would be this. He talks about imbalances on a chessboard. Okay, so when you look at a position, let's say your opponent has some pawns moved in front of their king. Their king is exposed and weak. That's one imbalance. But let's say your opponent also has the bishop pair against your knights on an open board, and the bishops are controlling your knights. Okay, that's another imbalance. Let's say you have some doubled pawns or a backward pawn. That's another imbalance. So when you look at a position, you need to identify the imbalances, but you also need to know, like, okay, what do I do with that information? How do I make decisions based on that? That's what this book is about. Okay, what are the imbalances? How do you need to think about them? How does that affect how you play? I've heard amazing things from it. I think it's slightly more advanced, geared for players like maybe above 1400. But, every video that I do, I'm going to try to make sure that I explain it so that everybody can follow. So How to Reassess Your Chess is the other one. And then last but not least, Silman's Complete Endgame Course. Again, this is a pretty hefty book. It's 500 pages. But from what I have heard, it is not your typical endgame book. Okay, a lot of time endgame books can be dry. They can be, just kind of boring. Like, I don't want to study this position. He writes in a different way. It's supposed to be much more engaging. There's some humor, I think, thrown in there. And one thing that I really like about it is he breaks the endgames up into categories based on rating. Now, of course, that's a bit, subjective, but there's like under 1,000, you should learn the basic checkmates with the king and the queen against the king. Like, for example, this position would be one of the endgames in the under 1,000 category. How do you win with the queen in this position, right? Or a rook. And then as your rating goes up, there's different sections of the book with more and more advanced endgames. So that's kind of nice. We could start at the beginning and just kind of work our way up. I've heard amazing things about this as well. So these are the 5 books. I would like to either do one of these or a combination of these or something along those lines. So what do you guys think? We've got 2 endgame books. We've got 2 kind of middle game positional strategy books. We've got the Bobby Fischer, My 60 Memorable Games. Please let me know. Vote in the comments. Upvote the one you want. This is going to affect probably a lot of the videos that I make going forward. So I really would love to get your feedback on those. And I'm excited. Like I said, we have one more game here, and then we are done with this book. So I'd like to get the votes kind of taken care of now so that I can start planning for when this series ends and we can just kind of pick up where we left off. So I hope that makes sense. Lots of comments probably coming through, but that's okay. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time for the last game in Logical Chess Move by Move. And as always, stay sharp, play smart, and take care.